Hey y'all, welcome back to another history video. Today we're going to be talking about Japanese expansion in East Asia. This is one of two case studies that you're going to need to understand if you are using the case study topic to move to global war. The other case study is going to be German and Italian expansion, which I'll cover in another video, but not today. Today is just about Japan. What you need to get out of this video is that you need to understand how to use this content and put it towards documents. So paper one is entirely document-based. You're going to see cartoons, you could see pictures, you could see excerpts, you could see speeches. You could see any number of things all relating to the same topic surrounding either Japanese expansion and or German and Italian expansion. What you're going to need to do is be able to synthesize the knowledge that is in these documents, use it with your background knowledge, which we're learning today, and to be able to answer several questions. You'll have to understand content, purpose, value, limitation, origin, just like you had to on your IA. You'll need to be able to talk about it, compare and contrast with other sources. You'll need to be able to do a number of things with the content that we're learning today, but the most important one is going to be the last question on paper one, question 4, which is going to be an essay question. Usually they're worth about 9 points, and that is going to be what you're going to use the bulk of this knowledge for, because instead of answering questions about the documents, you're going to be supporting a thought using the documents. And so you're going to want to pull in a lot of this background knowledge. As always, there is going to be a chronology point. Chronology just means that you know the events and the order. For that, we have this timeline that if I remember this time, I'll put it on the screen now. And what you can use this timeline for is to study the order of the events. You don't necessarily need to know the dates of the events, although that can be helpful if your brain works in dates, but my brain works in order. And you can get your chronology point by saying this happened over this. And so that's what I recommend doing if you're not good with dates. There is no guarantee which one of these topics will be on the actual exam. Recently, I did a practice test that was all about the tripartite pact, and that was the entire document base, was all about that pact. And so you had to have all this background knowledge to use it to apply to those sources, but I don't know what our topic is going to be, though I would guess not the tripartite pact. All right. Now that you've seen the timeline, we've covered what you want to get out of this video, let's jump right into it and get through this as quickly as possible. All right, so causes of expansion. Let's look all the way back to the beginning of when Japan opened back up its borders after a long-term 200-year period of closure and isolation. And that is because of a U.S. Matthew Perry. And Matthew Perry is going to end this 220-year isolation, and Japan is going to agree to it. Matthew Perry went to Japan because he wanted to trade, as always. What do Americans want? They want money. And that's what Matthew Perry wanted. So he went to Japan despite the border being closed. And because Japan saw how China's opium war affected them, because they weren't able to connect with the Western source, the Western culture, the Western database, they suffered and ended up with the Opium War, which is basically just a run on opium in China. And they decided that they didn't want the same thing to happen to them because it really created some lasting negative impacts in China, which you don't need to understand. You just need to kind of know it's there. So as a result, Japan decided to open their ports to U.S. trade. There were some shifting of emperors in China and some changes to the government that made it more Western instead of more Japanese. We kind of lose the shogun, daimyo, samurai, ronin kind of order of operations, and we move towards a more democratic, or we will eventually move towards a more democratic system, and I'll get there. So let's talk about militarism and nationalism. Militarism is obviously going to be relating to the military. It's a desire for a strong military. It's a desire for a powerful military, whereas nationalism is a love for the country. And I don't just mean that you like your American flag, though it can mean that. It also really means to have a very deep-seated, strong passion that your country is the best, and that even going as far as to say your race is the best because of the country. And you will see this in Japan, where the Japanese race is seen as superior to even the Chinese or people from Taiwan. Everyone is below Japan, especially Westerners, and you'll see that they don't feel recognized eventually. But for now, you need to understand that Japan, as they became a more modern nation state, and they kind of came up with this goal of rivaling the Western powers. I'm talking Europe countries, specifically, like think of Britain, think of France, think of the United States. These are the people who we think of at the top of the world at this point, and Japan is really wanting to get on their level and rival them. They ended up having some territorial gains, and they wanted those because of their strong nationalism. If you think your country is the best, you think your country is going to deserve more land, and that's exactly what happened to Japan. So eventually we have these kind of Shintoism beliefs start to appear. And Shintoism is, well, let's back up. If you know the word Japan in Japanese, it's going to be Nippon. Nippon is going to, the kanji used is going to be land of the rising sun. And that is what Shintoism refers to. It's the idea that the rising sun goddess, it is the rising sun goddess land, and that the sun goddess had blessed their land, and that was their story, that was their understanding. That's why the flag used to look like a sun. I digress. That is going to really seed us in this nationalism, like, we're the best, we're the best, we're the best kind of mindset, even as far back as this. And so we start to have rise to some pro-nationalist groups, some imperialist groups, because we want to spread Japan, and we want to make it a better country and a bigger country, and because we deserve it. And so eventually we're going to fall into the First Sino-Japanese War, which is against China. Whenever I say Sino, I mean China. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but we're not going to worry about that today. Specifically, we're talking about the First Sino-Japanese War. There will be another one, but this one is in 1894 and lasted until 1895. So just 1 year, pretty short war, but it did result in a Japanese gain of land. They did take over part of northern China at this point, just a little bit, and they felt that they had fairly done so. They had a simple win, they gained some economic dominance over China, and of course the Western powers didn't like this. So they formed the Triple Intervention, not the Triple Party, or not the triple, nothing else. The only name this one will go by is the Triple Intervention, and you need to know that it is for the First Sino-Japanese War. And the Triple Intervention was a diplomatic intervention by Russia, Germany, and France. Listen to those names: Russia, Germany, and France. These are three countries who are not seeing eye to eye all the time. So the fact that we have all three of them looking at Japan and saying, you can't do that, is kind of a big deal, especially because later on down the line, you will see Germany kind of moving towards Japan instead. But here in the Triple Intervention, those three countries really went to Japan and said that they needed to return the territory that they had won during the First Sino-Japanese War. And of course, this created some resentment in Japan because they felt that they had won this war. Logically, they felt that they had gained the territory respectfully, and they should deserve to keep the land. But of course, that's not how the rest of the world saw it. So it really reinforced this idea in Japan that they needed a strong military in order to represent themselves and in order to kind of stay on top. It also led to some intense industrialization because they wanted to be able to keep up with the Western powers who they now directly feel like they're competing with. Flashback a few years, a little bit less than 10, and we are going to have the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. This is going to be the first alliance between a Western and non-Western nation, and it is with the goal of preventing Russia's spread in Eastern Asia. All right. The Russo-Japanese War occurred not long after in 1904, and it lasted until about 1905. So again, another relatively short war, and it was due to competing businesses and also revenge or revanchism. This is not a term you're going to need to know again, but it is important to understand that the background is there between Russia and Japan. Japan did end up winning, but deciding to settle for money on both sides. Japan felt like they had gotten a little bit of good stuff, but Russia really got out because they got to escape. And so Japanese citizens were kind of upset that they lost some territory because they did decide to settle. During the First World War, Japan re-seized some land that it gave back after the Triple Intervention. So Japan gave back all this territory that they had gained during the First Sino-Japanese War because of the Triple Intervention, and during the First World War, they did gain some of that back. This does bring us to the 21 demands, and this is going to be a topic you need to understand, so pay attention here. The 21 demands were a secret ultimatum from Japan to China. They were a list of demands that would give more control for Japan over China, specifically their territory, government, and economy. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're really talking about the fact that Japan feels like they own something of China, and they're trying to get that back with these 21 demands. And these 21 demands are going to be a very secret ultimatum, which means that Japan is going to do something bad, that being probably take over, if China doesn't agree to these demands. So after some resistance, these 21 demands changed to 13 demands, and they were accepted. Japanese territory gains were solidified in the Treaty of Versailles as well after this First World War, and so that really set everything in stone that Japan was starting to climb the ladder here. Although there was some gain here, Japan was still relatively disappointed. They wanted racial. This is kind of a big note here. Japan asked for a racial equality clause for the League of Nations. What that would mean was they felt that as an Asian country who is climbing the ladder, they felt that they might have been discriminated against because they are an Asian country or an Eastern country. And so they asked to have a racial equality clause in the League of Nations write-up, and that was denied. So they didn't get that clause. And that's going to come into effect later, where they really feel like they are being hated on because of the lack of that clause, that they could have fought back if they had that. But they didn't, even though they asked for it. So let's talk about some more domestic political and economic issues here. So Japanese expansion between the First Sino-Japanese War and the Treaty of Versailles created some internal debate between destiny as an Asian leader and increasing military action. Usually we would think of them as hand-to-hand, but when you need to focus on either the homeland or the rest of the world, that was kind of the issue that was arising. This also created some concern about Japanese reputation and Japanese economy after expansion, because again, as we get bigger, we have to control more land, and sometimes that isn't as clear-cut as it should be, especially when it is another country like China. So World War I did create some benefit to the Japanese economy. It created some supply gaps in Asia, and this was caused by France, Great Britain, and Russia, and Japan was able to fill these supply gaps and was also able to supply some goods for the Triple Entente. And this is really going to create some economic stability in Japan, which is really good for them. They also had an issue with the Russian Civil War around this time, where they were asked to supply troops for the Russian Civil War, and they did, but they oversupplied troops. They overshot what they were asked to do, and they overstayed their welcome, so to speak, meaning that they stayed in Russia for a considerable amount of time after the war had ended, just occupying the territory. This kind of created some more distrust. This is going to be a big theme when we think about Japan and expansion and the West, is going to be distrust between the West and Japan and the issues that's going to cause. This is one example of a place where Western distrust was really created because Japan had went against the rest of the world and decided to overstay their welcome and oversupply troops and really take a bigger part in the Russian Civil War than they needed to. And that was going to create some distrust, like I said. So Japan really became the internationalist, desiring cooperation, understanding. They wanted some understanding between the nations. They ended up leading to the four-power treaty in 1921 between Japan, the United States, Great Britain, and France. This replaced the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, and eventually this too would be replaced by the nine-power treaty, which is again just more countries, including the agreement to respect Chinese independence was a part of this nine-power act. So we also had at this time lots of numbers here, but the five-power naval treaty, which is just going to stop plans to grow a navy and create some tension in Japan because they thought that the international kind of plans to slow the building of a navy, etc., is going to limit the Japanese kind of military and the Japanese power, which is, again, if we have very strong militarism, we think we are the best, we have really strong nationalism, we are not going to be happy by our powers being limited, even if it is agreed to, the citizens might not agree. So we, at this point, have what's called the Taisho Democracy, which came after the Meiji period, which is what we just discussed. This is going to bring some more liberal tendencies. When I talked earlier about bringing in a more democratic institution, that's what's happening here, is the Taisho Democracy. This is going to open up society more, but as a result, it is going to expose a lot more. When we have open doors, we have an open policy, we are going to show our weaknesses, and that is what happened. There was political corruption and specifically financial scandals that really diminished the public trust in the Japanese government. And so although we thought that this would be a good thing, it was not. There was attempts at censorship and questioning of people, trying to question the political structure in Japan, and it just didn't work out well. And at this point also we had some issues with foreign policy, and we also had some issues with the United States, which as a result of these changes in foreign policy, the United States ended up limiting immigration and excluding Asiatics and that is an exact quote. It's not a good word, but it really was directed at Japanese immigrants who were coming over, and it really offended the Japanese who were still in Japan by limiting the Asiatics' immigration. This is going to come back up, which is why I said it several times. If you were wondering how to spell Asiatics for your exam, it's just Asia and then ticks. No K, just TIC. All right, let's talk about the Great Depression very briefly. This is going to be playing a bigger role in the German and Italian expansion, but it is still going to be a little bit important here, specifically because we had some show-off fascism and like aggressive foreign policy at this point. There was a shift from there's going to be a shift from what we had just talked about as the Taisho dynasty, or the Taisho period. The Great Depression is really going to damage faith in international economy, and that's going to be for everyone, but specifically for Japan, who is relying very heavily on the international economy, especially because they were filling gaps in the economy in Asia. They're going to be very concerned by the fact that the international economic system is failing. And so it really raises doubts specifically about the United States as a trade partner, because the United States did play a very, very big role in the beginning of the Great Depression. And so as a result, there's going to be some more distrust there, and the United States is going to raise tariffs, damaging the Japanese and damaging like Japanese expansion and Japanese economy, and just encouraging expansion in general to be able to build back up this empire that the United States just knocked out from under them. So again, this is important. There were tariffs. The United States put tariffs on Japan. Tariffs and embargoes are really just economic issues with trading. So they're going to limit trade, or they're going to make it more difficult for the other party. And that is going to be a result of the Great Depression in America, and also of the difference in foreign policy from Japan. So let's briefly talk about China, because this is where the primary expansion is going to occur for Japan, is China. There was a lot of political instability. It's really not super important to get in depth here, except we do need to understand the Guomindang and the Chinese Communist Party. The Guomindang is just commonly shortened to GMD, and the Chinese Communist Party is typically shortened to CCP. You can write both on your exam. It's not super crucial that you get the spelling of Guomindang correct, as long as they know what you're talking about. And I would put in parentheses GMD and just keep writing GMD every time. So what's happening here? So we're having some ideological issues in China, and we're having some issues with the way that the government is structured currently. There were rebellions, there were like Westerners withdrawing, and the acceptance of the 21 demands, which were actually the 13 demands at that point. It's really leading to some anti-Japanese sentiment there, and it's really creating some instability. And instability leaves room for fear and for change. And that's what's going to happen in China. So because we had this segmented warlord kind of controlled regions, this really allowed the Guomindang and the Chinese Communist Party to take rise. And by the way, I haven't said this, but the Guomindang is going to be the nationalist party. These two groups have very different ideologies, like different spectrums, different sides. But at this point, they see the political instability, they see the issues that are in China, and so they decide that they need to move against their differences and really work together to try and better China. So what happens when we have two groups come together who have a lot of differences but try and put them aside? The answer is it doesn't work, and it didn't work. China really had some issues because they couldn't unify themselves and create a unified China. This really left some cracks for Japan to slip into. So, like I said, there were some ideological differences that led to the split, and this created renewed political instability in China and liberal democracy in Japan. This combination of these two things is going to result in a second Sino-Japanese War, which is why I kept calling the other one the first Sino-Japanese War, and just general Japanese expansion into China. All right, let's talk about specifically the events that happened in the time frame that you need to understand for the exam. That doesn't mean you can't use the details I just went over, and you should, but it just means that those are kind of the background, and this is going to be the meat and potatoes. All right, so let's talk about Japanese expansion into northern China. So at this point, we have some ultra-nationalists, like right-wing, significant influence kind of people who were really starting to grow. And you're going to see here that Japan does a lot of not okay things. For example, we have some sabotage, some assassination, some espionage on other countries and China. And there were kind of issues just in general about like needing to dominate. And so that's going to bring us to one of the most important topics of the Japanese expansion, and that is going to be the invasion of Manchuria. Manchuria, for the record, is just spelled man, Churia, Manchuria. All right? Manchuria. If this is a question on your exam, you will probably see it written like 70,000 times. I wouldn't worry too much about spelling, but it is just so you recognize it, because I know I say some words a little bit differently, but Manchuria. So the reason why the Japan wanted to take over Manchuria first, because it was a small, like, kind of city in China, is because there was coal, iron, bauxite, and cheap labor. And Japan at this point is very focused on their economy. We were just kind of in the midst of this Great Depression. Japan is really having some issues with their economy because they really trust the United States, who has now put some tariffs and embargoes on them. And so they really need to turn to a place where they can expand and kind of restabilize their economy. And for them, that is going to be Manchuria. Furthermore, we are going to see some of this racial superiority kind of start coming into play, by which I mean any Japanese man who lived in Manchuria during the time when Japan took it over is going to be paid significantly more and have significantly safer jobs than Chinese men were. This is common, we see even in the United States with black men and women, and even Asian men and women, and white men and women kind of taking the role of the Japanese men in this situation. But here we really have the Japanese racial superiority taking over kind of the job market because of this cheap labor. So let's talk about the Mukden incident. So the Mukden incident was an event staged by the Japanese military. So pause. I'm going to talk about staging a lot of incidents here in the coming minutes, I suppose. And one of them is going to be the Mukden incident, but this was a very common thing. And remember when I mentioned just briefly ago how Japan was really doing a lot of things that were not great? This was one of them. They were staging a lot of things to come up with excuses to take over different parts of China or Taiwan or other areas, but specifically right now we're talking about Manchuria and the Mukden incident. So this, again, was an event staged by the Japanese military to serve as their reason to take over Manchuria. So while they know that it has got coal and iron and bauxite and cheap labor, they can't give that as a reason to take over, so they staged the Mukden incident, which was an issue about the railroads, where they accused Chinese men of sabotaging these railroads into Japan from China that they needed for their economy. And so once they said, well, you did this, and they pointed some fingers, they had the reason, quote unquote, to take over Manchuria, and that is what happened. Initially, there wasn't a lot of fighting back on the side of China. China was kind of weakened by this political instability, and the Guomindang was not doing a lot to fight back. So eventually the Chinese Communist Party, and this is part of how communism spread in China, the Chinese Communist Party was willing to step up and start kind of fighting back. So eventually they were fighting back, but Japan then bombed some civilian areas and pushed China out of Shanghai, and they were able to take over Manchuria and make it into a puppet state called Manchukuo. Manchukuo. You don't need to know that name. It is the exact same place as Manchuria. This was in 1932. So again, right around that Great Depression time where we're really starting to see a lot of the cracks. So at this point, there was a truce that ended the Manchurian invasion, and China agreed to leave Japan alone there. So what happened here is that Japanese actions alienated Western powers due to their disapproval. Again, there's really a lot of distrust and disapproval on the side of looking in from the Western powers. They were not happy with the Japanese actions, and this was one of them. They took the issue to the League of Nations, which issued a ceasefire that only China followed. And they also eventually investigated it, to which they said that while neither side was at fault, Japan was the aggressor and should have to pay sanctions and leave. But instead of being held accountable, Japan just up and left the League of Nations. And this exposes a really interesting point and really important point about the League of Nations, and that is that they did not have a lot of power over bigger countries. So think of the Great Britain or France or Japan, who have the power to just walk out and they're still okay. That's gonna bring in a lot of the issues with the League of Nations that we are going to eventually try and solve with the United Nations. But here, Japan just up and leaves. And that's what happens. Because of the Great Depression, the issue wasn't pressed at all, and so them leaving was just how it happened. This really strengthened Japanese militarism and nationalism, though, because when you see others against you, you think, I have to be better than them. I have to get ahead. And that's exactly what they tried to do. So we really, at this point, start to see some rival factions in the army. And two major factions that we're going to talk about is Strike South and Strike North. Strike South is going to advocate for defense and modernism, and they want to consolidate China before they move to the rest of Southeast Asia. Whereas Strike North is going to be much more aggressive state Shintoism and totalitarian militaristic reorganization, and Bushido, which is like the samurai kind of like, we are Japan and Japan first, and they would kill themselves if something happened. And that was really what the Strike North wanted to hone into. But specifically, they thought of communism as the enemy and wanted to take over any area with communism, including and especially the USSR, before anything else. So that kind of brings us to why Japan was able to take over Manchuria so easily, is that China was kind of embarrassed, and so they just let it happen. So that brings us to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which isn't super important, but it happens. It's there. It's going to really bring in some more militarism. This is a running theme. I just keep repeating myself. Militarism, racial superiority, dislike of the West, over and over and over again. These are the points that are hit over and over and over again. That's what's happening in China, or that's what's happening in Japan. So we have the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And this is when, again, another one-sided compromise kind of staged situation. Japan claimed to have been attacked by China in Wanping near Beijing. And Japan attacked Chinese positions at the Marco Polo Bridge, which was an important railway junction. Again, we're seeing a lot of railroad similarities here. They tried negotiations, but of course that wasn't going to ever happen. And so the leader of the Japanese military just sent in more troops anyways. There was kind of a precedence of Japan kind of forcing on compromise and saying, okay, well, give us what we want, please. But that's not what happened this time. Instead, Japan attacked Beijing, which was another incident in Shanghai that kind of pushed against the Chinese again and led to more land being taken. So that brings us to the Nanjing Massacre. So the Nanjing Massacre, and I'm going to give a big content warning here, like trigger warning. You should be careful if these are things that are going to trigger you. Even though we've talked about a lot of war and a lot of death, this is a lot. So the Nanjing Massacre is going to be a Japanese major war crime and abuse of human rights in Nanjing in China. And in about a month, 20,000 women or cases of rape, mutilation, and murder were recorded in 1 month, in the first month, or 20,000 rapes, mutilations, and murders. This was really the result of racial superiority. When you have a group take over another area and they say, well, we're better than you, give us your women, that's what happens. And that's what happened in the Nanjing Massacre. So kind of like a solemn moment there, not a good time. Quite interesting, as it is a very, very direct show of the impact of racial superiority in Japan, but it's really sad. So then, of course, we move on from Nanjing and we move into Eastern China, and we kind of pull out of peace negotiations again. Shocker, shocker. And so the effects of all this is going to lead into the National Mobilization Act of 1938. And that is going to be signed by the leader of Japan, of course. And it put Japan in a constant state of readiness for war. So the government at this point had control, or could take control, of business and industry, price, rations, money. As long as it was for war or in a wartime, the government always had the power to do this. They had to have a reason, but it doesn't mean it had to be a good reason. So there was a new order in East Asia that Japan was trying to push, and this was putting Japan as China's primary trade partner and making the West kind of deal with the leftovers of whatever Japan didn't want. So they were really trying to take hold of the East Asian, specifically Chinese kind of trade situation there. And it is important to note at this point that while we see a lot of strength in Japan's actions in China, there were some issues and there were some areas that they were not able to effectively take over because of the Chinese Communist Party. This party continued to kind of attack and counterattack, and that really made it difficult for Japan in some areas. But because the Guomindang still had relative control over China, it wasn't an issue everywhere. It did, however, relegate Japan to keeping to mostly the outskirts of China, which is what they wanted anyways. That's where the trade ports are. It also kind of relates to the idea that Japan was unable to maintain troops in China. So when we have a lot of territory gained at once, we have to consider what's happening in the homeland or the original country. And in Japan, they were not able to protect it as well. They were not able to really focus as much as they did. And so as a result, both China and Japan had some negative side effects because of Japan's non-ability to really keep control very well. And of course, the international community continued to condemn China without doing anything really. In China itself, Guomindang was seen as not doing enough, and they really didn't crush any conflict. They didn't do anything. They kind of just let the Chinese Communist Party take over, which is again what led to the growth of communism in China, is because they were the only ones who were doing anything. So let's talk generally about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the events that led up to that specifically. We're almost done, I promise. So I already mentioned at the beginning the Tripartite Pact. I just kind of briefly touched on the fact that it exists. Let's talk about it now. The Tripartite Pact, kind of background, I guess, is the occupation of Eastern China and the seizure of political power by military and the willingness to create a totalitarian defense state. So really, Japan is kind of bulking up. They're changing the way they do shipping and production and investments into Manchuria, which then became vital to the Japanese economy because of the Great Depression that really helped them to overcome it as Manchuria. And we're really having some more like fighter jets being made and stuff like that in terms of economy at home. So this kind of created some increased concern and resentment in the United States and about the United States and the policies that they had towards Asia. For example, at one point, Roosevelt even suggested that Japan create a Japanese Monroe Doctrine, which, if you don't know, the Monroe Doctrine was a U.S. thing that said, if you step on our land, we fight you. And so Roosevelt was really suggesting that, which you would think would be a good suggestion, but in reality, it was seen as a very, like, secure Asia for the Asiatics kind of thing, which is, again, not a good thing and kind of embarrassing to say out loud, but it was a thing, and it was very much seen as like you stick in your corner and we'll stick in ours, and we don't want anything to do with you because you're not even on our radar. And that's kind of how it was seen. So this kind of led to Japan really seeing U.S. influence as threatening and hypocritical. And so a lot of the actions that are going to happen from here on out from Japan are going to be deterring the United States, who they see as like digging on them. They see as like very threatening and very hypocritical and like just very, very negative. And so they're going to want to detract from that as much as possible. So at this point, Japan had like a little scuffle with the USSR and lost, which caused Strike South to be supported because, again, Strike North was the one who really hated communism and Strike South was more on the side of defense and kind of keeping everything how it is. And that is the one that started like winning out because of the loss against the USSR. And Japan went, yeah, we can't do this. There was a major international dispute over a Japanese naval blockade of a kind of like basically a British settlement in China. There was some issues there. And Chinese resistance killed a Chinese man working with Japan. And Japan said that the killer was in the British concession, and so they blockaded it, and it was like big drama for nothing. Shocker. Everything is big drama over nothing, and this was, again, one of those times. Negotiations were just really aggressive, and so when the U.S. declined to get involved, this is really when the Tripartite Pact, there are many names, Tripartite Pact, the Berlin Pact, or the Triple Power Pact. I prefer tripartite, that is what I'm going to be using, but any of those three you should recognize. Again, this is not the intervention or the triple intervention, this is the Tripartite Pact. They're different. I don't know why I get them so confused, but I do. The Tripartite Pact was really about like late game, and the triple intervention was like early game, okay? Okay. So this was a German, Italian, and Japanese pact. So this is together. This is including Japan, even though they both include Germany. This one is about Japan. And this one is including Japan, whereas the triple intervention was against Japan and against the Sino-Japanese war situation. This one was really including Japan, and it was between our main three guys here for the move to global war, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they're agreeing to cooperate to deter the United States. So what do I mean by that? Well, really, all three of these countries had something to gain by keeping the United States out of their war and out of their territory. The United States was a big threat at this point, as they thought to themselves, I don't want that. And so they agreed to work together in big fat air quotes, because nothing really happened. They really didn't cooperate very much outside of outside of one situation, and that is after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and then very, very shortly after, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States. So they all went to war at the same time with the United States, really, because of this pact, but that was the only major thing that came out of it. And again, this was in 1940. All three were kind of distrusting, but they didn't like the United States. They said, yeah, we can be friends about that. So let's talk very briefly about northern Indochina. This is kind of, I don't see it as very important, but watch, that's the question this year, is all about northern Indochina. I digress. This was kind of an opportunity for Japan to take over some more land in Indochina, which kind of includes like Korea and China and Southeast Asia and like kind of those areas. And they really wanted to take it over. There were, at this point, kind of like, we've really settled on Strike South. We've really like moved away from Strike North. There were some more increase in economic sanctions from the United States because of the increase in expansion from Japan. And so again, when we have sanctions, embargoes, tariffs, when we're taking away money from a country, we're not gonna like whoever did that. And that is what happened. And so there were some negotiations that were occurring between Japan and the United States at this point, but it was really there to buy time for Japan to prepare for war. It was meant to avoid like a strong war, but it didn't obviously amount to anything because there was little to no effort put in from the Japanese side. There was an ultimatum from the United States that asked Japan to pull out of China and Indochina, and of course, this didn't happen. But because this ultimatum was put out, and it was put out publicly, this kind of made Japan really the aggressor, and so they decided to lean into that and to bomb Pearl Harbor with the goal of mainly with the goal of taking out the to take out U.S. fleets in Pearl Harbor and to bomb the fleets and take them out. I just said that. To take out the fleets. There were supposed to be 3 rounds. There were only 2. Then there was a declaration of war. And this was supposed to arrive 30 minutes before the bombing. It did not. Because there were issues with the embassy. People couldn't translate it fast enough. You can't make this stuff up. People couldn't translate it fast enough, and so they didn't get the declaration of war before the bombing, and they just bombed. And then, of course, Germany and Italy followed and declared war soon after. This was kind of a turning point in the war from, like, just kind of a European war to a very strong world war. They kind of brought in Asia and the United States at the same time, so it's really 2 groups from neither here nor there, and it really made the war an international war. They were only able to, in the end, temporarily disable the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which they were trying to do to keep them out of the Pacific, which is where all their expansion had occurred. So let's kind of go back and talk a little bit about, just a tiny bit about, kind of the international responses, or like the crises that happened and kind of what people thought about them. So let's really talk about the League of Nations, because this is something that I can very much see you or the question driving home to a very strong point. 3 months after the Mukden incident, which is again the issue with the railroad that kind of led to the invasion of Manchuria, we had the Littow Commission. The Littow Commission was to investigate and report on Japan in Manchuria. This was put forth by the League of Nations, and this was kind of really highlighted the fact that the Manchuria issue was a crisis. It was problematic for the League of Nations because both Japan and China were important members of the League of Nations. There was the Great Depression occurring at the same time, and there was European drama in regards to how they should handle things in Asia. As a result of all of these issues, the League of Nations took a long time to publish the results, and they tried so hard not to offend anyone. Like, they've really tried, man. They said that Japan had economic needs and China had to protect it, and they blamed China for the breakdown of the Sino-Japanese relationships. But they didn't really cite any reasons for Japanese behavior, but they didn't really give any reasons. It was very, very weird. You don't need to know any of the specifics about the Littow Commission, other than the fact that it really didn't say anybody was at fault, and then it kind of hinted at the fact that Japan was the aggressor and kind of egged them on to maybe give some money back, give the land back, and it marked the end of Japan being in the League of Nations. And then because Great Britain and France didn't care at all, it really ended collective security, which was this understanding that we're all in this together and we are all safe as long as we're together, because clearly nobody was. There was weakness, there was inconsistency. It was a mess, and so that's why we don't have the League of Nations anymore, because it was just terrible. There was some political developments in China. There was a May 4th movement. There were we're having this whole issue with the Guomindang and the Chinese Communist Party, as I've said before. There was some guerrilla warfare happening on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, which attacked Japan head on, where the Guomindang was very timid. And the US gave some aid to the Guomindang and gave them the ability to bomb, which did virtually nothing. I think that is pretty good. If you don't understand the international responses from everything I've already said, you can let me know. If you have any questions in general, you can let me know and I'll be happy to answer them. I really enjoy this topic. Clearly, we got through it in 40 minutes, which is pretty record for us here. And I will make another video, a separate video on the German and Italian expansion. You can see why now I decided to do it in 2 videos, because imagine this times 2 plus probably more, because I don't like Germany and Italy enough to talk about them with so much gusto. But I digress. And let me know if you have questions.